welcome to the show for this month. The book this month is a fantastic piece of comedy, of 80s, of just a period. This is a great comic. It's one of the best comics of all time. It's Buddy Does Jersey, which is collecting issues of hate. And we are really, really, really happy and lucky to bring our guest, Peter Bagge. Two-shot. There we go. Hello, Peter. How are you, sir?
Brian?
Yeah, thank you for coming. Thank you for doing this. And I'm really sorry that the
that the sun is shining on my
jacket. No. I've got like the light bouncing on me from the outside for like just until it sinks below the horizon. Okay. Yeah. So my first question is always this. I love this question. Why comics of all of the kinds of art you could do, and you're a musician as well? What is it about comics that thrills you, that lights you on fire, that is the way that you want to tell stories?
Well, first and foremost is I always loved comics, and just growing up as a kid, it always seemed to me like a perfect medium, and it was a relatively easy one to duplicate as opposed to trying to make your own movies. Although me and my brother also used to make our own movies, but it was like with Super 8. And again, my older brother Doug, who passed away decades ago, he was a really good cartoonist, and I would do comics mainly to emulate him. But I very much like the fact that it wasn't that hard. Like, you had the tools at your disposal, and you could afford to buy them. It wasn't much, as a drawing utensil and a piece of paper, and with that, you could create this art form. And I just always found it like a perfect way to express myself, a very easy way to express myself. Never wanted to be a straight writer, especially I'm a terrible speller. And back before we had word processors, that just meant you weren't going to be a writer. And I went to art, I took art classes in high school. I went to art school. I just, all the other major art forms, sculpture, painting, I didn't enjoy any of them. Really hate painting. It's way too messy. Hate working with paint. And Photoshop is just the greatest. I used to, the early hates, I would hand color them with watercolor. But it was so much nicer when all of a sudden you could just do it on Photoshop.
Yeah. So you went to art school, you said, but there probably, God, I really hate this light. I feel like I should come down like this so you can actually see it.
And have it right in your eye.
No. So I assume that there wasn't like a comic specific class or course that
actually I went to the School of Visual Arts, and I chose it for one reason. They accepted me because my grades were just abysmal. They accepted everybody. And I didn't even know that they didn't have then a comics department, but the School of Visual, to say it aloud, SVA is the School of Visual Arts in New York City. It actually was started by cartoonists. It was started by Bern Hogarth.
Yep.
And while I was there, I quit. I ran out of money, and I quit after a year. But I would sit in on classes being taught by Harvey Kurtzman and Art Spiegelman and Will Eisner. Those were the three comic classes at the time. Oh, and I did take a course it was a drawing class, but taught by an alternative cartoonist named Jack Moriarty.
Yeah.
And around that time too, I very quickly started to meet. Even after I quit art school, I started to meet cartoonists, and I would learn so much more. I'd go to somebody's house. I'd go to another cartoonist's house, and in one afternoon, he would show me how to do color separations the old-fashioned way. That would have been a whole course at the School of Visual Arts. So I learned so much faster just simply going to somebody's house.
Yeah. What was your presumed career track at that point? Because it seems to me that you weren't really doing material that was not suitable, that's the wrong word, but it wasn't the kind of set that Marvel and DC was doing. It certainly wasn't the kind of stuff that, like, say, Warren was doing.
No, I never had, even though I was a comics fan, I never was interested in, or never was much of a fan of genre fiction, superheroes, all that stuff. I would pick them up occasionally. When I was very little, I can remember the one superhero comics that would jump out at me was anything drawn by Jack Kirby. Sorry. So to me, there was Jack Kirby, and then there was everybody else, and I didn't like anybody else.
Yeah.
In that genre, and you know, it's the same with Warren. I could tell the artist drew good, but I didn't want to do that. I had no interest in doing comics like that. I only wanted to do funny stuff.
Yeah.
But then by the time I got into high school, I quickly outgrew even Mad, let alone any notion of doing a daily comic strip.
Yeah.
Syndicated strip. I couldn't imagine doing that. I really didn't know what to do. I like the stuff in National Lampoon, but what really set me on the path that I wound up going down was underground comics. I've seen just glimpses, I've caught glimpses from in my hometown of underground comics, and I knew Robert Crumb's artwork from, you know, T-shirts and posters, and I loved it. But it was when I was actually able to, when I moved to New York City, this was in the late 70s, and was able to buy underground comics. Just everything about them, particularly Crumb's work, but also Bill Griffith and Robert Armstrong and Kim Deitch. Those were my favorites. And later on, Aileen Crumb.
Yeah.
I love the fact that they treated a comic book like a blank canvas, that from cover to cover, it was all theirs, and they just did whatever they wanted. It reminded me of what I did with my brother, except that I didn't think you could publish that.
Right.
Of course, I found out the hard way that was not a way to get rich. Yeah, for the first time in my life, when I started buying underground comics, and especially Crumb's, that's when I knew exactly what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. I knew I wanted to be an underground cartoonist. Yeah,
but at that period, by the late 70s, early 80s, I mean, my understanding is that most of the head shops had started to close down at that point.
Right.
And so that distribution system that allowed that specific thing to happen kind of disappeared.
That's right. Another thing that I found out the hard way. It took me a while to register, to take note of the copyright marks in these comic books.
Yeah.
After a while, I realized most of these were made in 1971 and 1972.
Yeah.
And that even the more popular ones, like Gilbert Shelton and Crumb and Bill Griffith, they would just have like one comic book come out a year, and nobody else had a comic book for the most part.
Yeah.
So yeah, I did not know that whole market had completely imploded. Where I would buy them in New York City, I would buy them in independent record stores. They still would always have the spin rack, all crammed with the underground comics.
Yeah. Yeah. No, so San Francisco, New York, probably Los Angeles, Chicago had a market of some kind, but like everywhere else couldn't get these things for the most
like my
part.
hometown. I grew up 40 miles outside of New York City, and I never saw an underground comic for sale.
Yeah.
Where would I go? Where would I look? It wasn't until I moved into Manhattan, and even still, you could count on one hand how many places you could find them.
Yeah, yeah. So you did a zine, I guess, Comical Funnies. Is do I have that right?
Yeah. It was a tablet. I got to know a handful of cartoonists who pretty much were the staff of Punk magazine, and Punk was all through the late 70s. It was kind of a big deal.
Yeah,
and I submitted some comics to them. I loved their magazine because it was very cartoony.
Yeah.
And they were going to run some work by me, but then they wound up going out of business. So, but then I don't know, about a year later, this would have been 1980. I just met up with the editor and publisher of Punk magazine, John Holmstrom, and just to see what he was doing, what was up. And neither of us really had an outlet for our comics, so us and some other cartoonists, we just pooled our resources and made, it was like a tabloid. It's like a comics newspaper with a 3-color cover. Printed it up as cheaply as we possibly could And we did 3 issues of that way back then. I also, around that same time, I started getting published, but it would be like not even like Mad Magazine back then was pretty much a closed shop. I wound up working for Mad decades later, but other publications that were doing stuff for kids, I would occasionally do. I wrote some Bazooka Joe jokes.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And but other than that, doing work for porno magazines. It's funny. Both porno magazines and publications aimed at pre-adolescent boys, they had the same art sensibility.
Yeah.
Aesthetic. So, and not just me, it's like all of my cartoonist friends. That's who we did work for. The main go-to was Screw.
Yeah.
His old magazine, because it came out every week. He always used comic art on the cover, and and every issue had like a 3-page comic in it.
Yeah.
Did a lot of work for them. I did a lot of work for High Times back in the day.
Yeah.
So
did they pay what we would think of today as professional rates back then, or were they leaning into the comics to because it was cheap?
Well, it's like we would compare what Screw would pay to like what Playboy would pay.
Yeah.
Which was like 1/10.
Right.
Like if you did a 3-page comic, I think you'd get $500 for the whole thing.
Yeah.
I could be wrong.
Right.
And again, we'd always be comparing it to whoever was paying a lot more.
Yeah.
But
in the 80s, $500 would pay your rent for a month, right?
No, that wasn't bad. It wasn't too bad. I still was not making a living. They weren't. I mean, they were using a lot of artists. I might have do a 3-page strip for them or a cover for them once, but like 4 times a year, maybe.
Yeah.
And so it was a real struggle. And I still had a day job for the longest time. Worked at a bookstore for years, and then I really wanted to do my own comic book. I met Gary Groth and Kim Thompson of Fantagraphics because I saw that they started putting out comic books.
Yeah.
Maybe with the Comics Journal. It's funny. I've told this story many times. For some reason, because they were such know-it-alls in their magazine, I just assumed they were old men. I was shocked when I met them. It's like, God, they're like maybe just a year or two older than me.
Right.
But so when I met them, there were certain strips that I had, certain stories that I had that they liked so much that they told me that they'd publish my own comic book. It was so flattering that I never even thought about how much work that would be, and 2, how badly that would pay. But it was a dream come true. So that wound up being neat stuff. Yeah.
I want to talk about this, but actually, let me just go back just a little bit more. You submitted your comics to Crumb, and Crumb made you the editor of Weirdo.
Right.
And that to me is the most startling story, that essentially some young punk kid gets handed the reins of what at the time, other than Raw, was pretty much the preeminent magazine, right?
Right. Well, I was, for all kinds of reasons, I was thrilled when I first saw Weirdo. And again, for listeners who don't know, Weirdo was an anthology that was edited by Robert Crumb, who was like my favorite cartoonist. Started in 1981. In some ways, it was, at least when it started out, it was a bit of a response to Raw magazine, because Raw had high aspirations, and I could tell, I could sense that that's what Crumb was thinking. Yeah. And Weirdo is more up my alley. I like that he still wanted to wallow in the gutter.
Yeah.
And greatest of all was inside the pages of Weirdo was Crumb's mailing address. So I immediately wrote to him, sent him some comics I did. That Comical Funnies you were talking about, I sent him copies of that. He wrote back. It was a while before he published anything by me, but we would write back and forth. Every time an issue would come out, I'd write him a fan letter. And then it was a couple years after that he asked me, he wanted to keep the magazine going, but he didn't enjoy being a managing editor.
Yeah.
I wound up quitting too. I didn't enjoy it. But
I just love this. I love this period of time where the way we communicated was writing letters back and forth.
Right. There's those little postcards that cost 13 cents to check.
Yeah.
Those blank postcards, and we used to communicate that way. I mean, I would talk to him on the phone occasionally, but once we did start working together. But he was great. Of course, I was surprised, and and I and other people keep asking me, why did he ask you? Because we had never met. But he just said, he goes, he liked my comics, and compared to everybody else that he'd been corresponding with, he thought that I seemed relatively sane.
Yeah.
How's that for my praise? But he was fantastic, though. He never, of course, that job didn't pay well. It was a headache for many reasons, but he was very supportive. Only gave me great advice. All of his advice just rings true to me to this day. He was the greatest.
It seems to me like putting together an anthology of cartoonists is like worse than herding cats, right? Because everybody's got their own kind of way of working and their own thoughts about what they want. How did you kind of balance that and make it something that you could handle?
You never knew what it was like to deal with any of these artists until you did. Like there was some, like just for example, I can remember Robert Williams. I reprinted some paintings of his. It was his idea. I didn't think to me, it didn't make any sense because his paintings are very colorful.
Yeah. We
reprinted them in black and white on newsprint.
Yeah.
I can remember I had some suggestions about laying them out. I just said, well, how about, I never, with any of the artists that I worked with, I never forced anybody to do anything, but a lot of them would act like I did. And Williams did, and he just blew a gasket. But at the same time, Kim Deitch, who is as experienced as Robert Williams, if I would ever give him any advice, he would always take it. And he kept telling me, you give such great advice, and which to me was amazing. It's like, because it would make me think, who am I to tell you how to do anything? But he found it all helpful. And some artists were fantastic to work with, and it didn't reflect on their work. There were people where we were lucky to have them do work for
sure.
Except again, for an obvious example, Drew Friedman. He was just, his stuff is amazing. Here we are paying $50 a page. It could appear anywhere. It was so good. But he was a dream to work for. No complaints, very professional.
Yeah.
And, but then there were other artists who were lucky to have their work appear in a Weirdo, and they'd be such pains in the ass. Be so demanding, they blow all their deadlines.
Sure.
The one artist, I'm not going to name names, loved his comics, but he couldn't make a deadline to save his life. Yeah. And I would ask him why, and he goes, I don't know. It was like a mental illness. He had some mental illness. He just couldn't he blew every deadline and blow it by months. And I'm like, why? I gave you 3 months to do a 1-page comic strip, and you blew the deadline.
Yeah.
And I go, why? I don't know. I'm just
so what did this teach you about doing your own comics, and particularly, because Neat Stuff was an anthology of sorts, at least. Did it give you lessons that you needed to use?
Well, of course, not like I didn't know this already, but it told me to be responsible and don't presume anything. Try very hard not to be difficult.
Yeah.
And also try very hard. Like when you're communicating, sometimes you'll get an email or a letter from somebody, and at first it seems dismissive or insulting. So it's hard to remember. Don't presume that. You might have simply misread it. It might just be a typo. Don't fly off the handle, because I've had, being on the opposite end, I've had people fly off the handle.
Sure.
But it also told me I didn't want to be an editor. Although it's funny, you have the Buddy Does Jersey, which collects the later issues of Hate, and I turned the back pages of Hate into a bit of an anthology. Started running work by other people, but for the most part, there were people I knew. I would collaborate with some people, and it'd be somebody like Rick Altergott, who would have, and I already knew him. Found him very easy to work with, and he would just do his doofus strip for every issue.
Yeah.
So it was pretty simple. It was pretty simple and easy.
Yeah. Well, also, I mean, there's an advantage when you're doing hate or neat stuff where you're in control of the work, and so if someone blows their deadline,
right,
you can produce a page if worse comes to worse,
right?
Yes. So when Kim and Gary invited you to do a book at Fantagraphics, they weren't publishing a lot of stuff yet at that point. I want to think that there were 4, maybe 5 titles.
Yeah, well, Love and Rockets was the one that caught my eye, actually.
Yeah.
But also there was another comic they did called, it was a funny animal comic called Hugo by a cartoonist named Milton Knight.
Yep.
And I actually knew Milton Knight. He lived in New York. I used to see him around. And he was the one that put me in touch with Gary and Kim. Gave me their address and their phone number and all of that. Other than that, there was Don Rosa.
Yeah.
The Donald Duck guy, but he had his own. Did he just call it Don Rosa's Comics and Stories?
Comics and Stories, yeah.
They had those 3 titles. Then they had, of course, other than that, it was magazines about comics. So there was Journal, then Amazing Heroes.
Yeah.
And for a while there was.
So 8 Ball, etc. were after that then.
What was that?
8 Ball, etc. were after that.
Yeah, it needs stuff. Yeah, this was. I met them like it was like the end of 1983, something like that. And then I moved out west, and so did they. So we both had to get settled before we got back in touch.
Yeah.
But yeah, so neat stuff came out in '85. Dan Clowes' first comic book, Lloyd the Willing, came out in '86.
Yeah.
That was immediate. I loved. I actually met him very briefly in New York City. I guess he was still living there. And just like me and John Holmstrom and Ken Weider and J.D. King were doing Comical Funnies, he was doing a magazine called Psycho. Did you ever see Psycho Comics?
Sure, yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
Him and Mort Todd and Rick Waltergott, Pete Fiedrich, I think. So I met all those guys at a Comic-Con. And I loved Lloyd Llewellyn, and then later on 8 Ball. I loved it so much, just thought it was the best.
Yeah.
I love Rockets too. I think those guys are just amazing. Especially when I started doing Hate, and the Hernandez brothers were still doing Love and Rockets, and Dan started doing 8 Ball. We used to be quite competitive. We were always when the new one came out. We would like the way we would compliment each other is like I would ask like Dan Clowes, "Did you see the new Hate?" And he goes, "Yeah." And I go, "What do you think of it?" He'd go, "Fuck you." I go, "Good." But I said "fuck you" to him a million times too.
Yeah. Yeah. So how did you make the step from neat stuff to Hate? Like what was the thing? What was the impetus to make that change?
That was something before we went on air. It was something I was going to touch on before when we were talking about alternative comics in the 80s and what a small thing it was. When I started doing neat stuff, my first title for Fantagraphics, Fantagraphics insisted that it would come out in a magazine format. And the reason for that is of what would fall under that category of alternative. There's Weirdo, like we were talking about. They were already doing Love and Rockets in a magazine format.
Yep.
And Harvey Kurtzman's American Splendor was magazine format. Yep. And they said, we want all of our adult comics to be racked together. They'll be in their own magazine size section. Because they said, what is comic book sized is Drek.
Right.
And I was not crazy for 2 reasons. I was not crazy about that. They didn't give me much choice. I had to go along with it at the time. But and I understood their reasons for it. I couldn't argue with it. It's just that aesthetically, I liked the comic book format. Like that's to this day, it's like my favorite format is a comic book, just a regular comic book.
Yeah.
And also, so many comic shops didn't even have racks for magazines.
No, exactly. I mean, that was the fundamental problem, right? Was that you didn't have the pockets, because back then the racks that they sold, the commercial racks that they sold, had the pockets pre-made, right? Yes. Like this rack behind me, there's no pockets, but Back
Right.
then, if you bought a rack, it had pockets, and they were strictly to that format.
Right. And also back then, I suppose this is true to this day, but so many, especially when you got out of major cities or out of college towns and you're in the suburbs, so many comic shops were mainly collectible shops where they also sold coins and baseball cards.
Yeah.
So if they did have a rack that was designed for magazines, it would be magazines about coin collecting
Right.
and about
Right.
stamp collecting and
Right.
about baseball cards,
Right.
and not for a weirdo or Americans.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it's interesting too to me that they made that choice given the tradition of underground comics,
right.
except for Weirdo. Everything else was comic book format. I mean, more like Silver Age or Golden Age comic book format.
And that's where, when I discovered underground comics, it was in a spin rack.
Yeah.
You know, and that's where I used to always see them. So it just seems like a more fun way to shop for a comic. Who doesn't love spin racks?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I wanted to switch format to that. That was one thing. And also with Neat Stuff, I just kept getting more and more story ideas for this one character, which was Buddy Bradley. There's the Bradley family, which he was part of. And it's not surprising that I had more story ideas for him. He was the most autobiographical of all of my characters.
Yeah.
And I was just hitting a roadblock with the other characters. I used to have this character named Studs Kirby, who was like this obnoxious right-wing bombastic radio host. And
really prescient too, in a way. Like today, you think about that, that's really kind of a prescient character.
At that time, I was doing him in the 80s, then by the late 80s, and I thought he was over the top. That was the idea. It's like, yeah, he's based on a certain type, but he's also a cartoon character, so I'll make him silly or crazier. But then two things happened. First, there was Rush Limbaugh on the radio, and then I don't know if you remember this guy, but remember on TV there was Morton Downey Jr.?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I remember that guy.
And so I saw the two of them, and I'm like, these are real life, especially Morton Downey Jr. I was like, these are real life human beings, and they are way more cartoonier than Studs Kirby. It's like, I don't know how I could top this. I can't top Downey Jr. You know, nobody would believe it if I tried to be cartoonier than this actual human being was. So anybody listening, if you've never seen or heard of Morton Downey Jr., you could probably find clips of his old show on YouTube, and it's worth it. Yeah, he was unbelievable. So again, running out of ideas for those characters. So then I was like, well, and then that's the other thing too, is I was still struggling to make a living. I had problems with naming my comic book Neat Stuff. A lot of people assumed it was for kids. It sounded cute, and I knew that, but I was being ironic. But the irony would be lost on people. And the comic was definitely not for kids, so that caused problems. So for all of those reasons, I said I should start from scratch, have a much simpler, shorter title, unambiguous, that would more accurately reflect the content.
Right.
And focus on one character, have a star character, and in a magazine format, hoping that all of this would mean bigger sales. And it did. It immediately was, it sold right out of the gate. It sold 5 times more than Neat Stuff did.
Yeah. I remember too, maybe that Neat Stuff was quarterly or semi-annually or something like that, and Hate was bi-monthly. Is that right? Or am I?
You're speeding me. Neat Stuff, the best I could do is 3 times a year. They wanted it to be quarterly, but I knew that wasn't going to be possible. With me drawing everything and writing everything, I couldn't do 4 a year. But Hate was more compact. And also with Neat Stuff, I was still experimenting all the time. It was a one-man anthology, so I was always trying to do each story in a slightly different style, use different drawing tools. Whereas with Hate, when I started doing Hate, I really wanted it to look like a comic book. I wanted it to look like a copy of the Freak Brothers, and draw it that way. Just fill it up with, draw it and fill for great tones, cross hatching. So I just took a thin pictograph and cross hatched the crap out of it, and that was its consistent look. It had that constant look throughout, which made it easier to draw. I was able to get it out quicker that way.
Interesting. Cross hatching to you is easier than not. That
Well,
seems
now,
insane.
with Photoshop,
Uh,
like when I switched to with Hate number 16, when it became the work that's collected behind you, when I put it back to New Jersey, then it was in full color.
Yeah.
And I at first I had some help with the full color. I still do. My wife still helps me with the coloring, although I'm able to color my work by myself. But Photoshop, but even like it used to be to give it some depth when you're working in black and white, it'd be gray tones, but it was those old Zipatone sheets.
Right.
And those weren't, it was easy to cross hatch than to work with those. Those were a real pain in the butt. Now to now to Photoshop with gray tones, that's quite easy. I've done that plenty of times in the last, like all of the graphic novels I've done.
Yeah.
Nerd and Reset and other lives, they were all just Photoshop gray tones.
Yeah.
Easy peasy.
Easy peasy. I'm told we have a question, so I'm gonna bring that question up. Rodrigo, your style seems influenced by animation, which I agree. Are there particular examples that were important for you when creating your own style?
Yeah, the Warner Brother cartoons, the Bugs Bunny cartoons, especially anything directed by Bob Clampett. For as long as I can remember, I loved the Warner Brother cartoons, but as years went by, like even while I was in high school, I kept liking them more and more. Of course, now I realize they were made for adults. They weren't made for kids like most cartoons are. But yeah, I kept getting them. I suddenly realized all these jokes they were telling, you got to be more grown up or know a little bit about the 40s and 50s to get these jokes. And I also began to notice who directed what. And I would be both knocked out and sometimes even freaked out by any cartoon that was directed by Bob Clampett. Just thought he was amazing. So I wanted my comics to get that manic energy, that crazy, exaggerated manic energy that he had in his cartoons. So he was a really big influence. Same with Tex Avery, although I would say more Bob Clampett than Tex Avery.
Yeah. What did you study animation at any point, or is this it's just picked up through osmosis?
Yeah. It's just I never wanted to be an animator. It's before the age of computers. It just seemed way too laborious. I would never have the patience for it.
Yeah.
And also to make a living as an animator, when you're starting out, you have to be very adaptable. You can't just work in your own style. You have to emulate whoever it is that came up with the characters. And I just, two things. I didn't want to do that, and I didn't think I could.
Yeah.
I'm sure my work would have always been found wanting.
I feel like the lesson I keep hearing about animation, not having ever studied it specifically myself, is the squash and stretch, right? Like that's what I always hear. That's what makes it funny or something. And when I think about Buddy in particular, I feel like he squashes and he stretches all the time. Did you pick that up just again through osmosis, or?
Well, yeah, just like the way that looked, and occasionally you would see that in print. Also while I was growing up, two artists whose work just totally got implanted into my brain was Big Daddy Roth, the hot rod guy who did Rap Fame, and Basil Wolverton.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about those two as well is I can remember they had such a strong impact on me when I first saw their work, and even to a degree, even Bob Clampett cartoon, that a part of me didn't like it. I used to find their work disturbing, but at the same time, I'd be obsessed with it.
Yeah.
It's like I'm trying to think of like in another art form. It's kind of like on later Beatle records, John Lennon songs. There's a lot of John Lennon songs that when I would first hear it, I'm like, I am the walrus or happiness
Right.
is a warm gun. And I'd be like, I don't like this. Oh my
Right.
God, what is wrong with this guy? And then I listened to it 1,000 times in a row.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But it's interesting how a part of me still thinks I didn't like these artists that I'm naming who are obvious huge influences on me. When the fact is I was obsessed with them immediately. I just
Yeah.
bought anything that I saw their artwork on, I would buy it.
Is there any manga that you were encountering back then?
No, no, not not really. I wasn't
Okay.
particularly interested in foreign comics. It's not like I thought it
Yeah.
was good. And like I bought and read. I saw it when that was published in English,
Yeah.
and in cartoons. And I was, they had Gigantor and
Sure.
Speed Racer, and I would watch those. But they weren't my. It wasn't like that was my favorite. I did nothing about it that I particularly wanted to emulate.
I feel like there's certain aspects, particularly like when you're drawing Lisa, where she gets that big eye thing that's very manga, you know?
Yeah, again, that would mainly come from like the artists I was naming for the most
Yeah.
part.
Yeah,
You
that's fair
know,
enough. Fair
yeah,
enough.
and
Worth asking.
you would see some of that in almost all cartoons, but to me, it seemed like with Warner Brothers, they either did that type of thing, that exaggeration the most, or they did it the best. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah. I think particularly of Osamu Tezuka as sort of the Westerners, Astro Boy and things like that, where it's the sort of the big round heads and the big eyes and the
right,
exaggeration from that point of view. It's like it's circles being exaggerated.
right, right. Did you ever just while we're on the subject of
Yeah.
animation, I don't know if he still does it, but for a while, the Ren and Stimpy guy, John Crickfalusi, he had a
Yeah.
blog, and
Yeah.
he would break down, like even like my comics, just not just animation artwork, but comic book artwork and illustration. And with being an animator, it was all about shapes.
Yeah.
He would take anybody else's art or any art that struck him that he thought was effective, good artwork, and
Yeah.
it would all just be circles and squares and and ovals and hot dogs. He would just, and that was the way he personally would see everything,
Yeah.
which clearly reflected in his own animation.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's really interesting how that's a particular thing. Because I certainly see it, sometimes, like particularly in the more exaggerated stuff, like when Buddy gets crazy mad or something and his head becomes larger than his body, and it's all shapes to me when I look at it.
Right. There was I was with Neat Stuff in particular. I was getting really into that. For one thing, I was getting response. I had a knack for it. This
Mhm.
crazy kinetic exaggeration.
Yeah.
I started doing more and more of it, and there was one story where I went really nuts, and the story wasn't even necessarily calling for it, but it was a story that had to do with like Mom Bradley and Babs Bradley. It was called "You're Not the Boss of Me." And I just, especially with Babs, I just drew her in such an exaggerated style. It was just rubber bands just flying all over the place.
Yeah.
And as I said, me drawing the style was getting a good response from a lot of the readers. But a part of me was like thinking, am I taking this a bit too far? And I can remember, do you know Heidi McDonald?
Yeah, of course.
She, the comic editor and
Yeah.
reporter.
Yeah.
She used to review and write up my comics a lot, which I really appreciate. But yeah, one time she called me up and she goes, "Pete, like, especially with that story that I just described," and she was in this latest issue. She's like, "Don't you think you're taking it a little too far?" It's like, you know what? I needed to hear somebody else say that because
Right.
it wasn't helping the story. Crumb
Yeah.
actually said the same. Robert Crumb actually said the same thing too about that particular story.
Interesting. So there is too far in cartooning then.
Well, it's what's necessary. Like now, when I do comics now, and I'm mainly doing biographical comics.
Yeah.
All I'm thinking about is the story. So it's I can't help it. That's the way I draw is cartoony. But but I'm always thinking about what will move the story along. How do I get this information down, express it?
Yeah.
What is the best way to convey this information that I'm trying to share?
Yeah.
Um, so if on some rare instance something exaggerated and goofy like that will suit, I'll do it. But gone are the days where I'd be thinking that way, where I'm thinking, oh,
Yeah.
I got to do that. The only time I might intentionally do that is if I'm doing like an illustration for somebody and the client wants that. That's what they're looking for, is something
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
unique.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I think there's a difference between doing or doing biographical comics and doing something like this, where you've got that kind of need to do the "Ooga" reaction, essentially. Yeah. There's another question, I'm told. Is there? And if anybody has any questions, please ask. If it's a good question, we'll ask it. From Thrice Great Art. That's an interesting name. The move to Jersey in Hate 16 was a big shift for the series in terms of artwork. Do you think the transition to color affected the comic on a deeper level in terms of composition, layouts, etc.? What an excellent question.
Oh, well, I knew when starting with Hate number 16, well, first, yeah, there was a shift in the story because I changed the location.
Yeah.
And I did that mainly because I wanted to get the first 15 issues of Hate was almost entirely about 20-somethings.
Yeah.
And I wanted to get children and old people into the mix. And the easiest way to do that would be to have the main character, Buddy Bradley, move back in with his family.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But also by then, mainly because of technology, mainly because of Photoshop and the internet, it suddenly became economically viable to do a full color comic. Up to then, it was extremely rare for an alternative or underground comic to be in full color. The covers were color, but the interiors were always black and white. So, and I always wanted to have a full color comic. I mean, it was a bit awkward at the time because people just associated black and white with alternative or adult comics. And of course, there was no reason that they had to be that way. And nobody thinks that way anymore. If any alternative cartoonist puts out a full color comic, nobody's going to yell at them or call them a sellout. But I got a ton of that back then.
Wow, really? You called a sellout for doing color?
What was so weird is then after a while, I wanted to expand the page count without increasing the cover price.
Yeah.
So we decided the best way to do that would be to sell ads. We actually had ads in those later Hates. And I figured, well, of course people will call me a sellout if I've got ads.
Yeah.
But what do I have? They're calling me that anyway. What do I have to lose? And nobody did. Nobody did. Nobody cared about the ads.
the thing that actually made you a sellout, nobody cared about.
It was fine.
Yeah. I love it. I love it. That's fantastic.
But working with Photoshop, that was new to me, and discussing it with the production department at Fantagraphics, they said, if you this is new to you, but they said if you color with Photoshop, if you keep drawing the way that you have with all the cross hatching, coloring that will be a nightmare. You want to use the bucket tool, if you're familiar with it, the bucket tool as much as possible, where you just point and click and that whole area that's encased with the line art fills up.
Yeah.
But they said, but you also have to really, like, the line art really has to be solid. You really have to trap it. Otherwise, it'll make coloring really difficult. For some reason, I don't know why I was insecure about my own artistic abilities, but I was afraid I wouldn't be able to do that. I mean, stepping away from the cross-hatching was fine, but I was afraid that my line art was just too jagged and that it would always cause leakage. It would make it very hard to use that bucket tool. And that was the main reason that I asked my friend Jim Blanchard to ink it for me, because he had a very soft, fluid, not a bit jagged line art.
Yeah.
So again, that obviously, with somebody else inking it, that obviously gave it another look and feel, and the color.
Yeah.
And also another thing I did too is I wanted to get more story in. The black and I work on very rigidly with tiers, and with almost everything I've done, it's 3 tiers per page, 3 rows of comic panels. And that was the case with the early Hates. They were almost all 3 tiers of comic panels. with the color aids, I switched to 4.
Yeah.
Which is a lot more work. It's a lot, but I wanted to get more story in there. I wanted without boosting the page count too much. I just wanted to squeeze a lot more story, which is pretty much what I did.
Yeah, when you were on 3 tiers, were you sticking to 3 panels a page? Is that the, or were you? Because I don't have a copy in front of me that I can grab.
Right.
Or were you more like 2 per?
Well, doing the 3 rows, those 3
Yeah.
rows, 3 tiers. I don't know. That's what basically what most comic books are built around that, especially traditionally. Again, when I was doing each stuff and I was experimenting a lot, I would play with that a lot. I would, not everything, but at least in the early issues, I would have all crazy shaped panels, star shaped panels.
Yeah.
It would be, just to do it, just to see if it worked. But it's doing that, doing all that crazy stuff. Anytime where you feel obliged to make an arrow to tell the reader what panel to look at next, that's not, to me, that's not conducive to good comic storytelling.
Agreed. Yeah.
Don't turn it into a job for
Yeah.
the readers. Listen, I've always had that same feeling with flashbacks. I mean, as a reader and as a viewer, when I'm watching TV, flashbacks just infuriate me, especially since they use them all the time on television now, and it just drives me nuts. It's like you're putting me to work. You're just putting me to work. Just tell me a story. I guess I'm a very linear-minded person, but I really have always resisted flashbacks.
Yeah, it's interesting when I flip through the book, when I flip through Jersey, there's the 3 panels per tier, but you're not going 12 per page. You're going more like 10 or 11 per page, right? So it's not quite that same density.
Well, do you have a Buddy Does Jersey in your hand right now?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, because if you open up, those are 4 rows, aren't they? Aren't they 1, 2, 3, 4?
No, they're 4 rows, but there's almost never more than. I don't see any that have more than 3 panels, and there's an awful lot of 2s, right?
Yeah.
So it's 2, 3, 2, 2, or it's 2, 2, 3, 2, or it's not 3, 3, 3, 3. If you see what I mean, that's what I'm trying to say.
3, 3, 3. Usually, when you do that, not just in my comic, in almost anybody's comic, it should, like, very often, for example, it'd be the same scene and you just want to go boom, boom, boom. Or the middle of those, they'll be all related. The camera would, so to speak, would be fixed.
Yeah.
And so it's just a quick sequence. And very often, too, when you do that, like the middle panel would have no dialogue.
Right.
That there would be that pause where the character and you are taking a breather, and then the kicker is, and the punchline in the last one. Or just any kind of vignette. That's true with all comics, where you do 3 or even more 4, where it's also, it's like a train going by,
Right.
So yeah, almost everybody in 1 tier, it's usually 2 or just 1, but 2 is the norm.
What's your physical process in terms of approaching the page? Are you doing layouts first? Are you doing scripting first? Like how do you approach from the blank page?
It's always script. Even if I'm just doing a 1-page script, I always write it. I always write it out. I might if it's a multi-page story, even if it's just a 4-pager, I'll write an outline, and then looking at that outline, I'll figure out how to break it into pages. It's another thing too about my work is I almost religiously will make the beginning of each page a new scene. It's always jump to this scene, jump to that scene. So I'm always tweaking the story. That's why I spend so much time writing and rewriting it, is trying to make a scene fit a page. And one scene might be 2, 3, or even 4 pages, although that's rare. Like with my biographical strips, they are almost consistently, every page is 1 scene, and then when you turn the page, it's a meanwhile. It's later.
Yeah.
You know, it's almost every page almost starts with a caption. You know, meanwhile in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Yeah. So are you thinking about comics as the page is the unit, or
Yeah, I very much think of the page as a unit. I can't stand when a scene starts in the middle. You know,
Right.
like when I was younger, I would do that, and it would be bothering me while I was drawing it. You know, it's like, oh, I should have figured this out. I should have figured a way to make this, you know, just less of this, more of that. Just do any kind of configuring to make it all make a scene end at the end of a page. Well,
Right.
that's the other great thing too. Or even if it's the same scene, I work hard to make it so that when like I said, when you turn the page, you're in for a surprise. There'll be some kind of a reveal opening up the very next page. Where like in a multi-page scene, the last panel on one page would be somebody going, "Oh my God, look at that!" And then you turn the page, there's a big scary monster, you know, splash on the next page. And hopefully you can arrange it so that you get that surprise when you literally turn the page.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, and ideally, as a periodical comic, it is literally the page turn. It's all the right-hand side pages. It's not the left-hand side pages. Yeah.
Both especially when I was doing that with Gilbert Hernandez, we were doing that comic, which was kind of like our, you know, our teen girl comic. I would do that a lot, you know, because they would go into outer space and run into aliens. So there's lots of, oh my God, look at that. What's that? Then you turn the page and it opens with some crazy scene. But it being DC, you would turn the page and there'd be an ad for Xbox.
Sure.
I hated that so much. And that was the other thing too that I did not know. It's like, can't we address that? Can't we, like, as you're laying out the comic, you know, when this is going to happen, when I'm doing that as a writer, that Xbox ad, can it wait? Can't you put it a few pages later?
Yeah.
It turns out they like an entire month's worth of ads for every single one of their titles is pre-sold, and that person paid for page 12. And it's going to go into page 12 in every single comic. And then I asked, well, while I'm writing it, could you let me know in advance where the ads are if they're pre? And they said no, because we don't know that far in advance.
Exactly.
You're going to win. It's like this is tailor-made to have every comic book ruined.
Yeah. So when you had ads in Hate, you placed the ads essentially. Yeah.
And then we tended to backload them too. They were mainly in the back.
Yeah.
And every issue of those color Hates that had ads in it, they all opened up with a long Buddy Bradley story, anywhere from 15 to 22 pages, and there would be no ad breaking up that story.
Yeah.
And so there might be an ad on the inside front page, then you get this 20-page story, and that's when you might come across the very first ad.
Yeah.
And,
so you write scripts first. How are your scripts written? Are they sort of screenplay style, like page 1, panel 1, page 1, panel 2, or are you just writing dialogue? Or
I used to even use you know, script thing and the applications that screenwriters actually use, which automatically goes to dialogue. But now I noticed that you know, like people like Neil Gaiman, they don't do that at all. It's tight, and it's not broken down where the character then dialogue and it's all everything is on the left hand starts on the left hand margin. And to be honest, I just noticed that was saving me to do it that way. It was saving me on paper and ink. So, you know, printer ink, which is expensive. So now I do it that way. I then once a script is done, I then separate. I print out the whole story, but I use a tight font, like an 8-point font, so that I could fit everything that happens in one page onto a page. So I print it out, and then here I have a piece of paper, and it has page 3, and everything happens on page 3 is printed out on this printer paper. And on another sheet of printer paper, I draw it. I do a rough, and just referring to that. And I never stop making changes. I still am constantly tweaking every step of the way, which can now with most people I work with, they're used to me, but that used to drive them a little bit batty, where they would approve a script, and then the end result would be like, well, wait, this is what happened here, and this was not like they were complaining, but they're like, why
Sure.
does this match the script I sent? But
Yeah.
I made it better.
Yeah.
Sometimes you don't know what's going to work until you literally draw it. You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. And when you're in the drawing phase, are you still working physically? Do you work digitally at all, or?
Yeah, no, well, digitally with word processors.
Yeah, right, sure, but not. But
Yeah,
the actual art itself is on.
Yes, everything's by hand. And
Nice.
it's just a ballpoint pen and typewriter paper or
Wow.
printer paper when
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
roughing it. When I'm roughing it, then
Yeah,
with the final art, it's Bristol paper with the tracing paper over it, and I pencil on the tracing paper first,
yeah.
and then I first with a light pencil, then with a dark pencil, and then
Oh,
I flip
interesting.
the tracing paper over and I draw it backwards. And with a very dark, soft pencil, and then I transfer that. I rub that onto the Bristol board. And and the reason for that I do that is I have to see my drawings backwards. It's the only way I can make certain corrections. It's this visual dyslexia that I have. I have
Interesting.
things that aren't working, that they're not coming together. I can't figure it out. But as soon as I see it backwards, I immediately figure it out.
Wow. I gotta tell you, Peter, the greatest thing about doing these kinds of interviews is, as I said, we've done something like 250, 260 of them. I never get the same answer twice from cartoonists about how they do work. I have never once heard someone say, "Oh no, I have to see it backwards in order to figure it out."
Cool.
I love that. I mean, that like lights up a part of my brain that I didn't realize existed.
The only artist I know that does something like this is Jason Lutz. But nobody else. I mean, I wish I didn't have to do it. It's a pain.
Yeah.
But it's doing penciling one more level. You know, which always, the more levels you take, then the better. Another nice thing too is then when I take the piece of paper and I transfer it onto the Bristol board, then I take a very light pencil, and with just this transfer, I redraw it. And again, every step of the way, I'm making little changes.
Yeah.
But I redraw it, but all the pencil is light. That way, when I ink, after I've inked it, then there's not like a dark or heavy pencil that when you're trying to erase it, you're digging up all the ink.
Yeah.
So I like having really, really light pencil. So that's another positive of doing it this way.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're going through and drawing at least 4 times.
Yeah, pretty much.
Wow.
Pretty much. Here's another positive with this whole transfer, this tracing paper thing, is again when you put the tracing paper with the pencils on it on the Bristol board, if let's say you have a close up of a character and you wish the character was a little bit higher in the panel, more to the left, more to the right, you just move the tracing paper. You just slide it around and then transfer it. So it's a very easy way to correct composition that way.
Yeah. Interesting. Wow, that's fascinating. I always sort of wonder how cartoonists who have to work and rework their work like don't go insane from that, right? That you don't just the funniest one was Klaus, was Dan, because Dan told me that he goes through and he pencils the entire thing first, the entire thing, even if it's a 200-page story, page 1 to page 200. Then he goes through and he does, I think the lettering was the next step. Then he goes through and he does the ink, 1 to 200. And I'm just like, how do you not want to kill someone at about page 160?
Right. Yeah, with me, with a long story, I'll write. The writing will all be done. Before I've drawn a thing, I'll have it all written. 100 pages. But then when I do a page, and again, I don't. There's a lot of artists who jump around.
Sure.
They like to get their feet wet, so they'll do like a boring page 17. They'll draw first, but they want, especially like page 1, to look very dynamic.
Yeah.
By then they're used to drawing those characters, so they'll say that later. And I can't. Again, I'm way too linear, so I have to. When I start drawing page 1 has to be completely finished before I.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, neat. I love that. I think that's fantastic. Let me actually kind of go back to the previous question, because one of the things that he asked that I don't know that we actually got to was, did the color, did the addition of the color change your actual approach to the art?
Literally only because of what we talked about before.
Yeah.
And yeah, maybe this might be by this point it'd be subconscious, but there probably are times where I'd spare myself having to put in much detail with the line art, knowing that the color would give the information that you need. But I can't even say for sure if that's the case. But once Hate did become full color, it took me a while to figure out how to make color work. And
sure.
the one thing I figured out fairly quickly is, and again, this is just me a lot, especially a lot of artists, they don't do this. I'm sure most of them, well, very few of them do. But when you're working with the CMYK process, you're blending blue, yellow, and red, or I mean cyan, magenta, and yellow. And you also have black. So with those four colors, you mix and blend to get any color. When I'm doing the coloring, I don't use any black. I don't touch black. So if I want to get a dark color, if there's something going to be very dark brown, or I want to get something murky, spooky, some scary basement or attic, I just do it all with the blue and the red and the yellow. And I don't touch the black.
Even today, you still do that?
Yes, I don't like the way it looks, and it just doesn't suit my work. And it takes it away from looking comic booky. I'm sure, I very much think of the way comics should be colored. I'm always thinking of like the 1950s or 60s.
Sure,
reading comic books then, and the color did that too. Marie Severin never incorporated black. It was always the other three. There was no overlay for gray tones. I don't know what artist started doing that, but I don't even know if boy, that's a good question. I'm trying to think if even Marvel Comics from the 60s, if they incorporated black, which would be gray. It makes it
not in the 60s. No, not in the 60s they didn't. It was by the 80s they started to. But and modern, today, right now, a cartoonist, a new cartoonist is looking at the entire rainbow of the palette, right? They're not thinking in terms of the limited palette. They're thinking in terms of gradations and purples and greens, and it's the whole thing.
And you're literally you're working with every color. And there's some cartoonists whose work I greatly admire, where you can't picture their work without them, like Chris Ware or Seth.
Yeah,
you can't imagine their work if they weren't incorporating gray into the colors. But I don't like that. It's the oddest thing. I hadn't seen Robert Crumb in ages until I saw him a couple of years ago, and he always said this about me when I started doing Hate and Color, and he still did. He says, he goes, what's the story with the color? I love the way your work looks in color. It really pops. And I told him, I don't mix gray in there. And he goes, that's it. Because he's also, he grew up in comics in the 40s and 50s.
Sure.
Oh, that's why I like it.
Did the sales on Hate jump up when they did, right? When you went color?
When I went to, no, they pretty much
okay.
Yeah, they stayed the same.
Okay.
Probably the best. Here's the thing: probably the best-selling Hates are the earliest ones, just because Fantagraphics kept reprinting them. So for Hate #1, I think there were 5 editions.
5 printings, there's going to be 5 printings, absolutely.
Right, and so there was, as we went on, I think that whole 90s run of Hate, I think they reprinted all of them at least once.
Yeah.
Because back then, a store like yours, you would have, if you could get them, you would have all the back issues of people.
Everyone that was in print, Yep.
Right. And there was a lot of
times have changed. That is not a thing that happens anymore, man.
Right.
We do not keep we don't keep 10, 12 issues of a series in print anymore, because because there's far too many series is ultimately what the issue is. So back then, Marvel or DC wasn't publishing more than 8 or 10 comics a week. Now they publish like 35 comics a week. And that's one publisher, and there's 30 publishers, right? I swear to God that an average week of comics has about 200 releases, not counting variant covers. If you add variant covers, it's probably 400 or 500 releases.
Right. But DC
Can you believe that?
I thought there was a dearth of actual floppies. That the number of floppies coming out, I thought they went down when
No, there's so many floppies out right now. And not floppies, periodical comics. I hate the term floppy.
Okay, yeah.
See, that's one I'll blame on Heidi.
I agree, but it's a way to make the lazy distinction. Yes.
Yeah.
I used to call them comic books.
Right. Yes, they're comic books. Exactly.
When things, especially in the alternative world, when more and more things were in the book format, square bound format.
Yeah.
Especially alternative cartoonists who were younger than me, all of a sudden they were all saying that they hated comic books, that they never wanted to work in that format. They just want to be in books. Where to me, I've given up. Of course, it's got to be a book. But just economically, it doesn't make sense otherwise. But I really resented that switch from comic books to graphic novels.
Yeah, and I think it makes it more difficult to tell certain kinds of stories, right? Because you then, if you have to do 150 pages,
right?
That's a serious amount of work. Doing 150 pages is very different than doing 20 pages or 25 pages, And I think, maybe I'm wrong, but I certainly think that a lot of the comics that we love and grew up with would never have existed if people had to do graphic novels. Like, I don't know that Dan Clowes would ever have a career if he had to do graphic novels back then.
Right. I think it's really strange to expect or even require young artists.
A 20-year-old. A 20-year-old.
Now, with the comic book, you're doing a short story, and that's how, throughout history, that's how writers learn how to write. Making mistakes in a short story. Or it teaches you how to get to the point quickly and succinctly.
Yeah.
And then
especially in comics, right? Because comics is the art of reduction. Right. Comics is taking an idea and finding the one image to juxtapose with another image that tells the story sort of as succinctly and precisely as you can. Yes.
Right. And the nature of it, with it being 24 or 32 pages at the most, it's forcing you to do short stories unless it's going to be continued. But one of my more recent big complaints too is here you have these artists who never had practice working in shorter form, going straight to graphic novels. But so many graphic novels are way too long. They're really dragged out, kind of like a Netflix miniseries. Where why is this 8 episodes? It could have easily have been 3.
Right.
Here we are, another downward angle shot of the corpse again. Did we?
Right.
But these graphic novels are so long, and their publishers are encouraging it. They want fat. They want you could charge a higher cover price, and so the profit is so much more. But people are like, oh,
I'm not sure about that last part, but I'll grant it as a thing.
Well, no, I've been told that. I've been told.
Have you? Okay.
Yes, when you do this comic, make sure it's a minimum of so many pages, and I've gotten into arguments about it. I'm like, that'd be too long. You're asking me to drag it out. You're asking me to drag the story out. You're asking me to make a story that's too long.
Right.
They want to add to the cover price.
Yeah. There's only a point where you can add to the cover price, though, because after a point it starts becoming too expensive for people to buy, is the problem. Right. There's like this magic price point. Anything over $20 is actually a really difficult sell,
Really? Oh, I was going to say it's not $29.95.
No, it's still $20. $20 is about people's limit of, I don't know what this is, but it looks cool, so I'll buy it. After $20, like, You have to know that you want it, which is great if you're following someone that you know that you like.
Right.
But
So
if you don't know what the work is,
an established artist, you get
exactly.
30
Exactly.
bucks.
Yeah.
But with a newcomer,
Yeah.
no doubt.
Exactly. So when Jersey was published, I mean, as the big thick compilation here, and it's in black and white, did you have to go and touch it again to fill in space? Do you like the way that it looks now?
Yeah, well, that was literally my only regret with those hates being in color was that the color, sometimes I felt it a little bit obliterated the very nice line art that Jim Blanchard was doing. So I thought, if we're going to collect it into a book, at the time when that book came out, you were still able to order, either see in the store or order from Fantagraphics, the color version.
Yeah.
Individual comics. So I thought, for something different, let's do this in black and white so that people could really take in and appreciate Jim Blanchard's line art.
Yeah.
So that's the only reason that we did that in black and white. And it wasn't a big, we just, when we scanned the art, the line art was on a separate file. So the Fantagraphics just pulled those and ignored the color.
Yeah.
And now with that complete hate, you can see those color, they're in color again.
Yeah. Yeah. Which do you prefer at this point?
Well, I like that exists. I like that there's.
Okay.
I like that you can see a black and white version of it. I like that there's a choice. I guess if I had to choose one or the other, it'd be the color ones. With the color ones too, like again, neither me and I had help with the coloring. Wasn't really quite sure what to do, so I feel like the earlier ones were a bit too dark. They were murky, and then over time, at a certain point, my wife Joanne took over as the colorist, and we live in the same house, and so
you would hope so.
So yes, so I mean, while she's picking the colors, and she used to pick it with watercolor. She would print out. We would make Xeroxes of Jim Blanchard's line art, and she would watercolor it and pick the colors that way. Very, very studious and methodical. But she was able. She lives with me. She was able to get into my brain really well.
Sure.
The other colors did a very good job, but they don't know me as well as my wife. So she really captured. She, for example, I'm pretty sure she was the one that figured out no black. We're just not going to mix K in there. And I'm like, I think that was her. I can't remember for a fact, but that might have been. When I would complain about things, I kept saying murky. Like with the earlier colors, it's murky here, it's murky there, and she's going. And I think it was she who says, "Well, they're incorporating black," and I guess she was like, "Clearly, is what your problem is." Yeah. So no more mixing in those grays ever since.
Yeah, I love it. There's another question, I think. Zoe, yes, or did we answer? Okay, there is another question. Mockies. Hi, Peter. John Kelly here. Thanks for the Pittsburgh shout out. Can you talk about the Hate cartoon series for MTV that you worked on with the late Ann Bernstein?
Oh, yeah. I just somebody asked me, I think it's for the Comics Journal. Somebody asked me to write. I wrote this brief remembrance of Ann Bernstein. And for people who don't know who she is, she's somebody that just passed away recently. She was an illustrator. She also went to the School of Visual Arts. So I've known her like since the early 80s. And then she was the cartoon editor for Nickelodeon magazine, and she employed a lot of alternative cartoonists there. And then for a while she was a staffer at MTV's animation department, and most of what she worked on was Daria, if you remember the Daria TV show.
Yeah.
But around in 1997, I had a development deal with MTV. And worked on trying to turn Hate into a TV show. We never did anything fully animated. I think it even appeared on YouTube. Unfortunately, I say unfortunately because it's not a finished product. It wasn't supposed to be seen. It was what you would call an animatic, a rather finished animatic.
Yeah.
And Ann Bernstein was like my story editor. And then at one point, she and I collaborated on a pilot script. yeah, and as I said, I remember we fought like crazy. She was very. I guess we were both stubborn, but I just remember fighting. I mean, she's no friend. It's terrible that she passed away, but that's all I can remember was just fighting over everything. I don't think I ever worked as a writer. I don't think I ever co-wrote. I think that was my first experience as a co-writer. And,
Right, right.
to be fair to her, when I think about that, and it's almost always television. I've had a lot of nothing's made it to the big screen, but I've had a lot of development deals through the years. In each instance, I have a co-writer. You know, like Hollywood will assign an experienced television writer to work with me, and yeah, that's usually the most fighting because it's not a clear labor division. It's not like with comics. I'll write it, you letter it, you draw it, blah blah blah. It's like we're both writing it, but the writing is the bones of it. That's the story. So and especially when it comes to a character, that's usually what would always set me off is you're collaborating with a writer, and the writer comes up but has a character saying something, and I'd be thinking that character, that person would never say that. He or she would never say that. But it turns into a fight because your co-writer made up the joke and they think it's a really funny joke.
Right. Yeah.
That's my joke. And you want me to throw it away? Yes. Come up with another best joke.
Yeah. Broadly speaking, and you know, I mean, you don't have to go into too much detail because you know, this is an impertinent question on my part. But broadly speaking, do you make as much or more money from the development deals than you do from the actual cartooning itself?
Yeah, it varies a bit. I mean, for a while I was doing, like when I was doing work for DC, you know, you get these flat page rates.
Yeah.
A graphic novel for Vertigo, which is DC, Other Lives.
Yeah.
And the page rate was just ridiculous.
Yeah.
I don't know how that happened. It never happened again. So it really varies. So it's something like that. That was really good money. But and it with these development deals, it really varies. But yeah, no, it's really good money. I mean, that's the main reason I do it because it's maddening. It's and I was just talking about arguing with co-writers. I don't mean to throw them under the bus. They're all people that I like. They're all people I think are funny. If I didn't think they were likable and funny, I wouldn't work with them.
Sure.
And that's like the least of the problems when you're dealing with Hollywood. It's just everybody. It's just the shocking thing about, from my experience working in Hollywood, is like literally, and this is not the case in comics, in the comic book industry, but with Hollywood, with all of these development deals, literally everybody is lying to me all the time. They're just always lying about everything. I don't, and also there's this weird obligation to always blow smoke over up each other's asses.
Yeah.
You know, like somebody will compliment you, and you go, "Oh, thanks." And then they're sitting there waiting, like I'm supposed to be just as fatuous, you know? Like, really, I'm supposed to talk like, because what you said was like totally over the top, and I don't need to hear it. I don't want to hear it, and now I'm obliged to talk that way. So that's the thing with all of my Hollywood deals. Labor-wise, great. When you compare how much money they paid me to the actual sit-down labor, that's no big deal. But it's all the bullshit. It makes me crazy. And I keep, every time I get a new development deal, I'm like, I'm not going to let them get to me. Don't let them get to you. And they always do. It happens every time. Lots of long walks. I take lots of long walks just with steam coming out of my ears.
Oh, I bet. I wonder too, like, doing graphic novels today, you know, when you're doing something like Fire, let's say, does that kind of a book earn back out the amount of time and energy that you're putting into it? Or
most of what I've put out, most of the books I've put out in the last 20 years, they probably were money losers for the publishers.
Yeah.
Like with the biographies that I did for Joint Quarterly, I'm sure they made money off of the Sanger book that sold the best. That was the first
Yeah.
one that sold the best. Also, she was like the most well-known and most controversial of the other three. With Dora Hurston with the Fire book, that was a little bit less,
Yeah.
and then way less with Rose Wilder Lane. And I had to say, none of it surprises me. While it wasn't like deliberate, I kind of figured I should get my feet wet with this more famous person, Margaret Sanger.
Yeah.
And then sneak in Rose Wilder Lane.
Yeah.
I've never heard of. Although I'm really happy with that book, and I'm very happy that I did it. But I'm sure it didn't make Joint and Quarterly a profit.
Yeah. Is it harder to get the next graphic novel contract given sort of that diminishing return?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And it's for that reason that now, I mean, I already started doing I've been doing comics for a magazine called Reason for the last 20 years. And they pay me a generous flat page rate. And they just, when I do a feature for them, they just want it always they go, just make it 4 pages. So for the last 2 years, I've just been doing these 4-page biographies. Of course, you're not getting the full picture of these characters. It's just these little vignettes about these various biographical figures. Yeah. And, and they pay decently, so I just do it for them. Eventually, that will be my next book, is doing enough that it can fill up the book. But yeah, that's my novel that I'm doing now, is this collection of short biographical pieces.
So in a way, you're kind of going back to the earliest days of you're serializing first. Right. That's how you're paying for it, and then you eventually get a book out of it.
Right. Exactly. And yeah, there you go.
It's interesting how the world spins around and around. Yeah. That's all.
Yeah, I don't know if I mean, people have agreed to do book projects, allow me to do a book for them. But yeah, with the advance, it's just not. I don't know. Maybe with the advances that I've been offered, I'm sure there's other cartoonists who would say, "Oh, I would gladly do it for that," but it just doesn't. It's not worth it. It's just not worth it. So what I'm doing now is better. I'm very lucky that I have this very comfortable relationship with Reason Magazine. And they've been really good to me. So and they keep me busy. That occasional freelance job, and that's all I've been doing for the last 3 years.
Yeah. No, that's great, man. Yeah. I wonder about just to keep it in the past just a little bit more about your kind of relationships with Marvel and DC. At Marvel, at DC you did with Gilbert, and Sweatshop as well, both of which don't strike me as commercial ideas for DC, right? Like about a girl band or about people who are cartoonists working hard in a sweatshop. Neither of those seem very commercial to me. And then when you went to Marvel, you worked on Spider-Man and Hulk, which they didn't ever actually end up publishing. Well, they did eventually publish, but not at the time. I'm just sort of curious about that period, right? Because it seems to me you've got a couple of different distinct periods of time.
Yeah, that all came together towards the end of the 90s and that's I never thought I'd get a phone call from anybody from Marvel or DC, and all of a sudden I was, and it was this is before the CGI movies took over the planet, and and I guess things weren't going great for them, so they were just let's throw shit at the wall and see what sticks. And I enjoyed working on all of those because the people who called me up, the editors that I dealt with. Marvel, it was Axel Alonso.
Yeah.
And with DC, it was Shelley Bond, and then Joey Cavalieri and Bob Schreck. And all really nice people, really good people to work with. They all gave me so much creative freedom, and I didn't push it either. I knew that even with something like Other Lives, where I knew it was, and they knew it was for an adult audience, and and it was for the Vertigo imprint. I still knew that I couldn't go completely crazy, nothing X-rated, so to speak.
Yeah.
And with I kind of wanted to do the exact opposite of Hate. Hate up until then, Hate was all I was working on for 10 years.
Yeah.
So I asked if I did a comic for them, I asked for the Comic Code authorities.
Oh, nice. Love it. Love it. Love it.
Wanted it to be approved, and I made this perverse promise to myself. I was like, I'm going to write a comic where whoever the Comic Code authority it is, and me and my friends always picture being a chimpanzee with a stamp. But I said, I'm going to write it so that person will never have to red flag anything.
Yeah.
And I did it. Like who cares, right?
Yeah.
But I did it. They never had. They didn't have to red flag a single thing I wrote.
That's great, man. I was actually hoping you would tell. No, there was this one time, however, they said that I couldn't do this fart joke or whatever.
There was a problem with Marvel did put out Spider-Man, that comic book, and then and I actually was going to do a spoof of every character that had a movie coming out, because the plan was just flood the market with that character.
Right.
And when my Spider-Man comic came out, they had like a dozen Spider-Man titles coming out to take advantage of that first one. And then the same with the Hulk. When the Hangman movie came out, and I was going to do a Thor one, I think. But what happened was, while I was in the middle of drawing, so I already had an approved script, but I was in the middle of drawing the Hulk story, that another company took over. They purchased
Marvel. Yeah.
Marvel. It used to be what was the guy's name? Perlman, who owned Revlon. He used to own it.
Yep.
He didn't care. It was ridiculous. They didn't ask me to change, other than just straight, dotting the I's and stuff like that. They didn't have me change anything with the Spider-Man comic. It was pretty much what I had originally submitted, and all was going well with the whole comic. But then this other company, they were mainly wanted to own. They bought Marvel because they made underoos.
Yeah.
So they wanted to own the characters that were on the underwear.
Right.
And they were total pains in the ass.
Yeah.
They were all of a sudden they were asking for changes just to ask for changes.
Sure.
Really petty. So that was annoying. And Axel Alonso was on my side. He was even more annoyed with me because he had to look at these people. So,
yeah.
And then finally we made an agreement. They paid me to finish it because it was so close to being finished, but they said we're not going to publish it. Ironically, then they sell it to Disney, and Disney publishes it.
Yeah. That's funny. I'm curious too, because you mentioned back at the top of the interview that the only kind of superhero comic that you liked was stuff by Kirby. But I feel like your Spider-Man comic was really like a great piece of Ditko work.
It was the story of Steve Ditko.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a libertarian myself, and he's like, I guess if you, I'm not a big Ayn Rand aficionado, and her followers, they call themselves objectionists.
Yeah.
And he is. So it's like, to a certain extent, I relate to where he's coming from, but also to a big extent, I don't see it gets into, even to me, it gets into kooky territory.
Sure.
I couldn't resist factoring that in. I couldn't resist at some point showing him reading the Fountainhead, just had to go there. So mainly what I was thinking of when they first asked me, do you want to do this Spider-Man comic? Of course, I was going to draw it, so it was going to be cartoony, so it was going to have this Mad Magazine-ish satirical bent to it. But the skeleton that I hung it on was I wanted to have the Peter Parker / Spider-Man character. I wanted him to start out as he is, and then he turns into Stan Lee. He becomes this arrogant hotshot, and then at the end he evolves or devolves into Ditko. That's weird, quirky, shut it. Yeah. So I wanted Peter Parker to turn into his two, evolve in, or devolve into his two creators, and that gave me a story arc.
It's funny because that's almost Amazing Fantasy 15, right? Like he starts off as being, oh no, I'm gonna go be a professional wrestler, you know, and then he discovers, no, I've actually got to do something different than that. I don't know. Anyway, who cares? That's Spider-Man. Who cares?
I know this is something like people like Dan Klaus, they can't believe it when I say this, but I totally can see why people like and admire Ditko's work. I totally get it, but to me it looks so dry. His artwork, so it doesn't move me at all. It never made me reach for that dime in my pocket.
Yeah.
A whole whopping dime to buy Spider-Man #1 would have been a good investment, of course. But yeah, it just doesn't grab me. It just does not grab me the way Kirby's art just jumped off the page. I just remember, and I believe I came across it more recently. There was this, I believe it was from either the Hulk or Fantastic Four #1. And when I was a little kid, gosh, I was like 7 when, and I went into my neighbor's house when I was 7 years old. This would have been like 1964, 65. And my friend's older brother was into Marvel. And I knew they were Marvel comics. I said, what's this? And he goes, oh, my brother really likes this imprint, Marvel. You know, it's like Superman, but different. And they were all over the floor and just open to random pages. And one page just jumped out. It was like this evil dwarf-like character. And it was the panel was a close-up of his pants. You just saw this evil dwarf's pants while he's talking and thinking. But the art of this evil dwarf's pants in this one small panel just jumped right off the page. I was like, it's like the drawing of a pair of pants is the most amazing thing I've ever. And then when it must have been a Hulk story.
That must have been the Hulk. Yeah.
Remember,
probably the where he's fighting the circus of crime or whatever.
Sure.
I don't know. It doesn't matter. So the other thing I wanted to ask you about is you mentioned earlier that you really don't especially care for genre work, which is a fair observation. But you know,
I kind of work mainly, like action adventure. I like the funny stuff. I just liked all the funny stuff in the satire.
But you had kind of a period where you did a bunch of genre stuff, sort of one after another. Other Lives, Apocalypse Nerd. Right. There's at least one more in there, and it was like waiting for a bus, right? They like 3 come at once.
Right.
And I'm just sort of wondering, was that you just sort of working this stuff out, or did you?
Yes, no, there were ideas. All of them were at a certain point. I just had ideas that would have been served as graphic novels, and 2 of them, both Apocalypse Nerd and Reset, they were serialized by Dark Horse.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But I was fortunate enough to find these publishers who paid me decent money to do these things. But they were stories that were in my head, certain things, certain thoughts that I was dwelling on, I was obsessing over, and I really wanted to get the down on paper.
Yeah.
So, and found people who would give me money to do just that. So, and that's how those all came about. But none of those did great. None of them sold great, which is why I've had ideas for other graphic novels, but no one's going to pay me to do that again, or at least not for decent money.
It's just funny that you pivot from that to doing sort of biography, and you know what I mean, which if there's any genre that pays less than sort of genre work, it's biography.
Although that's gotten big. It's biographic comics. There's a lot of them, especially for a while there. It seemed like there were tons of them. But when Apocalypse Nerd, when that was a comic, when it was coming out as a comic book, when it was being serialized, with each issue I would do a short little story in the back about the founding fathers.
Yeah.
And And that's how I got my feet wet doing biographical characters. And
Yeah.
also Discover Magazine had for a while, in each issue, I was doing a one-page strip about a scientist in history and his or her eureka moment. So, and I enjoyed it. I suddenly, after a while, I said I could go farther than this. The biggest problem with doing all these short, even like with these backups for Apocalypse Nerd, a problem with all of them was there's so much more to this character. There's so much more to this person. You know, their whole life is a big fat juicy story. So
yeah, and you've got to reduce it to 4 pages or whatever. And and I also feel as though their characters. George Washington has hundreds, if not thousands, of pages written about him already. Like, how do you find something for George Washington that is suited for comics? That, do you see what I mean?
Well, yes, and that's that is why, like, especially when I was doing these longer these full length biographies, why I was avoiding people who were super famous, who have been written about countless times. Is what else am I going to say? But with some of them too, somebody like the Founding Fathers, it's amazing how many different takeaways these biographers have. How somebody would really admire this one famous person for this reason or that reason. From researching all those Founding Fathers strips, I did quite a few comics about Alexander Hamilton, and as research, read a whole bunch of his biographies, read a whole bunch of books about him. So, of course, when I finally saw the Hamilton musical, I'm like, the whole time, I'm like, he's really playing that up. He's really downplaying this. He's whitewashing that. But of course, it's his musical. It's not my musical.
Sure.
And what's interesting too is I could always see why he did certain things. He had this musical going audience to consider, and so when he plays certain things or denies certain things, I'm like, oh, but like I can see why he's doing that, because he doesn't want people standing up and leaving.
That's really funny. Really funny. Well, I think we have one more question before I do the wrap up. Is that right, Zoe? Very good. And the one more question is, if they can find it, there it is, from Bob Kopman. Are there any buddy stories that you might still want to tell? Oh, I like that.
Sure. And I was doing, like, once a year, I was doing a short and the Hate Annual.
Yeah.
But they weren't selling great, and so they were selling less and less as it went along. So it's one of those things where it seemed like it wasn't worth doing. But I still had so many more ideas for Buddy Bradley. And now those ideas have kind of dissipated. They've gone away a little bit because it's not a thing anymore. But I was having no problem coming up with an idea for him every year. And while I was still doing those Hate Annual stories, I could have kept going forever. It's just that nobody cared. So it's just simply I haven't really thought about it. If somebody wants to make it worth my while, I'll gladly do it. It'd be easy to do because his life is my life. I just have to filter it to make it suitable to him.
But you're not shaving your head and have an eye patch and all that stuff. Like, I don't know. I feel like if, for me at least, if I lost interest, which it was only that my interest was reduced, it was that he seemed like he wasn't himself anymore.
Oh, well, he became a married dad.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I was making him more and more eccentric. He used to, part of his whole thing was being at war with the world, this youth culture that he was part of, but also not a part of, but rebelling against at the same time. And once with the Hate Annual stories, here he was all of a sudden married with a kid. But I also had him make choices and it was for him, these were conscious choices, even affectations, where he was choosing to do things that totally removed him from pretty much everybody. The eye patch, the junkyard.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It was totally taking him. He was taking himself. But that made him comfortable because and having this eccentric look that he came up with, this crazy Popeye look, people gave him distance. He looked like a crazy person, and that was, it wasn't affectation, but it also, and he didn't verbalize this, didn't have him verbalize these ideas, but it's like it served a certain purpose. It kept it kept society at a distance, and what he chose to do for a living did the same thing. It's like, this is not, really a junkyard. That's not a regular thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he was choosing to do all these things for that very reason. He wanted, and otherwise he'd just be, if he worked in an office, he'd just be yelling and screaming all the time. He'd be fired. If he had a regular job, he would be fired.
It's interesting because I feel like a lot of times that as I get more and more of being a middle-aged man, that my life becomes more and more about kind of narrowing my life, focusing on a specific thing or a specific way of expressing things rather than being open like we were in our teen years, right?
That's why you're doing that, because I'm like, yeah, you're becoming like me. You're becoming more closed-minded.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's what you do like, you like more, and what you don't like, you just want it out of your life.
Yeah,
it doesn't interest you. You just want to be away from it, and have more of what you do enjoy.
Yeah, I know. All right, well, so let's start to wrap this up. I got two last questions. The first one is the generous one of, you got anything you want to plug? You got anything coming up that you want to talk about? Maybe you're not in the position to talk about it yet, but what's next for Peter Bagge?
Well, like, that's just these strips I'm doing for Reason. When one comes out, I promote it on social media, and you could always go to Reason.com and just do a search at the magazine's page, and everything I've done for them is archived. I do illustrations for them every month. They have something called brickbats, which are just little news stories, and I do these little Mad Magazine type illustrations for that. And that's I'm doing that like every month. Mm-hmm. Yeah, almost everything I'm doing, other than, like I said, the occasional freelance illustration, has been for Reason magazine. So, and I'm very proud of all of it. I think it's great work. So yeah, just go and check that out if you have the opportunity.
Yeah. Some of us don't like digital comics, though. Some of us like things that are printed on paper and bound into books.
Oh, Reason, they appear in print in Reason magazine, but you'd have to subscribe to it to get it.
Right.
That's not on any spin rack.
Yeah.
And other than that, in a couple of years, I'm sure there'll be enough of these short biographies I've been doing for them to fill up a book.
Yeah.
Other than that, I don't have any other book projects.
Okay.
I'm slowing down.
Okay.
Brian.
I understand. No, it happens, and it's fine. That's good. I think we would all love to see another book from you, though.
Right.
And then the last question is as I said, we've done many of these. This is 250, 260, somewhere in that range of interviews. One of the big audiences for this, I think, is people who are aspiring cartoonists who wanna work in comics. And the thing I hear a lot is I don't know what to do. I don't know how to start. I don't know what the thing that I need to do to make comics. So if you had a piece of advice to give to someone who's interested in making comics, what might it be? It could be something practical. It could be something spiritual. It could be something emotional, philosophical.
Right.
What do you got for it?
As far as finding an audience, it's never been easier now that with digital technology and the internet. You can do all of the art on this gizmo and then share it with the world. Of course, it'll take a while for people to find you. But that's always been the case, and it sure is easier than the way it was when I was starting out, where that expression which is not exaggeration. The expression of pounding the pavement, just going from office to office, and where you're forced to live in Manhattan, and
Right.
you're getting rejected everywhere. Being able to work from home, even if you're just starting out and you're a nobody, that's the way to do it. And like you said, you don't like to read comics digitally, and I prefer to see them on a piece of paper. But yeah, you can always print it out. So it just seems to me like the way people have it. I mean, COVID's put a monkey wrench into everything up until now, roughly. But yeah, get your work seen online. Find fellow artists, create a community of like-minded people and fans online, and then to satisfy that social itch, go to comic conventions. Just go to comic. There's so many of them. Drink and draws and comic cons. It's those are few. When I was starting out, there were very few comic conventions. Now there's too many.
That's so true. That really is. Oh man, that's great. I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us, and I want to thank you for this body of work that you've done. This is great comics, and I could not be prouder to sell this and to promote this to people and to encourage people to read it. So put me on a 1, will you?
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
And if anybody is sitting watching this at home and you want to read a good comic, I thoroughly recommend this. If you buy a copy from us, there might be a URL at the bottom in a second. You'll get a special signed exclusive book plate by Peter, which is you can only get here, which is kind of cool. It's a really, really good book. A little bit of updates of news. The next show is Wednesday, where it's the Adult Graphic Novel of the Month Club, as opposed to the Comics Masterpiece. We're going to be talking to Victor Lavalle about Eve, a really cool piece of science fiction work, which is really good. And then next Sunday is the Kids Club, and we're talking to Miriam, I'm going to mangle this, I know, Bonastray Tour, who did, this was a webcomic originally called Hooky. And so I'm talking to her next week. And those are really good. Next month's Comics Masterpiece Club is really fucking awesome. We're doing Freak Brothers. We're going to be interviewing Paul Mavrides. And if you were to buy your copy of Freak Brothers from us, you will get a book plate that is not only signed by Paul, but it's also signed by Gilbert Shelton. How cool is that? Okay. So we love talking about comics, and we love you for loving comics. So take a look. I want to thank Peter Bagge for being our guest. Put him back up. So here it comes. There you go. Hi. I want to thank you for being our guest tonight. I want to thank you for taking the time and speaking with us. And I have so much admiration for you, sir, and your cartooning. This is a book that's very dear to my heart. So,
well, thank you very much, Brian. And your comic shop is fantastic, and appreciate everything that you're doing.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Take care.
Have a great one. We'll see everybody next month.